Well, if you remember, there was something called austerity. This was a deliberate policy choice taken in 2010 and persistently applied for the next 10 years. If you had wanted to try to make our population vulnerable to something like a pandemic, you just about couldn't have done better than the austerity policies. For example, 30,000 beds were cut in the NHS in that period. That is about 1 in 5. It's a big cut. Private care homes were privatised, and when the 30,000 beds were needed, at very short notice, in a panic, the government discharged elderly people from hospitals into care homes to make room for the pandemic workload. And of course, that caused mayhem and very serious numbers of deaths of the elderly. The other thing was that we had historically a very strong notification and isolation system dating back over 100 years. And because of the cuts to both public health and local government, that was not used by the central government when the pandemic struck. Instead, they dreamed up the infamous test and trace scheme under Dido Harding, which everybody agrees was a complete failure during 2020, one of the worst failures. And there was inadequate stockpiling of PPE, so our brave health and social care workers and many others had to carry on with very poor or even out-of-date PPE, putting their lives in danger, and some of them paid the ultimate price. And all of these things were consequences of that policy choice taken back in 2010 and adhered to despite the evidence that it really wasn't working. The economy was not booming in the 2010s, quite the opposite. And it caused a lot of unnecessary deaths. And those deaths, of course, were concentrated amongst workers who, another problem of this austerity policy, workers were not really funded very well for, if they had to take time off work. There was a furlough scheme, but for workers, low-paid workers, casualised workers, they had real problems if they felt ill. Many of them just had to carry on going to work because there was no government assistance to make good their incomes. And of course, these kinds of problems were concentrated in the poorest communities and amongst our minority populations, who often lived in crowded circumstances, having to go out to work, coming back into crowded homes. So for all kinds of reasons, ultimately traceable to the austerity set of policies, which were a choice. We didn't have to have austerity. That's why we were so vulnerable.
This idea that the government was somehow taken by surprise, that we could never have predicted this, that the government did the best that it could in the circumstances, it really couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, just as one example, in 2015, Bill Gates gave a very well publicised TED talk in which he said that with the emergence continually of new pathogens, with the increasing interconnectedness of the world through trade and tourism and travel, he predicted that there would be a large and lethal pandemic in his lifetime. Now, we don't have to take Bill Gates' word for it, because all governments, particularly the UK government, have planning systems, and they have what's called a national security risk register. And the UK risk register had for years actually had a pandemic at the top of its lists of risks. So they were expecting a pandemic, and it was a red risk. And a red risk is the worst type of risk. It's a risk that both has a very high likelihood and a very high impact should it happen. And because that risk register, which is signed off every year by the government chief scientific advisor, had been flagging up a pandemic, governments had been planning for that, and they'd been wargaming, they'd been testing their systems and their procedures to make sure that they were prepared for a pandemic. And the last big exercise that they did was called Exercise Cygnus, which took place in 2016. That was a really big test of systems, and they found a whole set of problems with the resilience of the care system, for instance, with the availability of PPE, and they made a set of recommendations. And then, as far as we know, there was not another major planning exercise after 2016. We then got into the post-Brexit vote. The planning started to focus on planning for a no-deal Brexit. And by the time we got to early 2020, the pre-pandemic months of January and February, pre-pandemic for this country, the government had taken their eye completely off the ball, and we had a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who during January and February failed to attend every single one of the emergency planning meetings known as the COBRA meetings, which were being called in the knowledge that a pandemic was approaching. The Prime Minister attended none of them. That there was, a disinterest in the processes of government and the planning for this sort of eventuality. And then in March, when we'd seen what had happened in Italy, because Italy was the first European country to be hit by the pandemic in a very big way, other countries had started to close down. France had shut down. The UK was delaying and dithering, and there's a lot of evidence now that's been published that tens of thousands of deaths happened because of the delays in that initial lockdown. Then we went through a lockdown. Then a lot of scientists said that we had started to unlock too early. We went ahead with schemes like Eat Out to Help Out, which was pushing people back into dangerous social settings. And then, of course, that happened during August. By early September, even before schools and universities had gone back, infections were escalating. And yet again, scientific advice was not taken, and infection rates were allowed to escalate up and up. And the problem with that is if you wait, then by the time you do lockdown, you have to have a much longer lockdown. So instead of what was advised, which was a quick 2-week circuit breaker, we ended up with a much longer lockdown. But again, it was released too early. So these mistakes were made. There was a U-turn on the pre-Christmas release. But by then, we were already heading for the massive spike in January cases, and there were 55,000 deaths between the beginning of the vaccination programme and the point at which it met its first milestone of 15 million vaccinated by mid-February. And of course, the vaccination programme was what brought us back. There's a story of 2021 is a very different one, but the vaccination programme was actually enabled because of the investment that had happened prior to austerity in the strength of our life sciences in our universities that led us to be able to bring forward the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it was the only part of the pandemic delivery that wasn't contracted out to the private sector. It was delivered by the NHS, and that is the single part of government strategy that actually worked really effectively. Everything else, I don't think is too harsh a judgment.
Okay, so a big important idea in the IPPR essay was that current policy needs to learn from history, from our own history, and I don't just mean the last 30 or 40 years. The history of Britain holds some extremely interesting and important surprises. People think, for instance, that the welfare state is a creation of Beveridge in the mid-20th century. What historians know, but unfortunately the general public and most politicians don't seem to know, is that Britain has an extraordinary historical achievement in creating in 1601 the world's first functioning welfare state, social security system, which was created by the Poor Laws of Elizabeth I. These Poor Laws were extremely important in providing every subject of the Crown with an entitlement to what was called relief, which means support when you need it, when you're old, when you're ill, when prices have gone up because of poor harvests. The Poor Law at parish level, 10,000 different parishes, each one of them like a mini welfare state, was mandated by statute and law to keep everybody alive. So this was an incredibly important basic form of security at a time when most of Europe and most of the world was living at subsistence level. And it enabled people to have an enormous sort of sense of security, to begin to really think of planning their lives, to no longer, if they wanted to move around the country, to be concerned about, for instance, their elderly relatives who they were leaving behind. England was the first country in Europe and the first country in the world where all of its population were free from famine. There was no famine in England after the 1620s. That's 150 years or more earlier than any other country or population in Europe achieved that kind of security, a really fundamental security. In the book, we are developing these insights further and pointing out that the crucial thing that the Poor Law in effect brought into being is what we call a collectivist individualism. Those two terms, collectivism and individualism, are so often seen as opposites, and in the sort of Yahoo politics of the last 50 years, collectivism gets sort of termed socialist, individualism gets termed, free marketeer, and never the twain shall meet. And what we're saying is that actually a proper, mature appraisal and understanding of our own history in this country demonstrates that we are an individualist culture, but we are a very particular kind of individualist culture, which is a collectivist individualist culture. In other words, when our society has functioned at its best, as it did from 1601 right through until the 1830s, and then again since the Second World War with the post-war welfare state, we've been in a society with a lot of collective resources and security for individuals to thrive, extending, in the modern period, of course, to universal secondary education, which was a novelty in 1944 when it came through, as well as, health insurance and so on. So it's that kind of provision, collectively funded, because money for it's got to come from somewhere, it's collectively funded, which enables individuals to thrive and to be their best selves, as we like to tell ourselves. This is not something that people just somehow do out of their own resources, unless you were fabulously rich. For most of the population, we need these collective resources, and for most of our history, we have provided them generously and willingly as a nation, and we should be proud of that, and we need to go back to it. Well, what our review of the last 400 years of British history shows is that welfare is not a luxury. It's not something as a society you only afford when you become rich and wealthy in the 20th century. History shows that actually universal welfare preceded modern economic growth, and there are good reasons to suppose that it facilitated economic growth. In other words, it's an important reason why it's very well known that England had the first industrial revolution. What's not as well known is that 200 years before the Industrial Revolution, it had the first welfare state. And we are arguing there is a causal link between those two. We're not saying that the welfare state is the entire reason why Britain industrialised. Of course, there are many other factors, but we are saying that it was an important facilitating cause, and you don't find a system like that anywhere else in the world at that time. So what it enables to do, what it facilitates in particular, is labour mobility, because if you have social security all across the country, it means that young people can leave home, can move to where the jobs are, which was often towns and of course big cities like London. First of all, without fearing that they're leaving their parents behind to penury, because they're not, because the parish will look after your parents. And secondly, if you do make that move and take that risk and things go wrong for you, you're not somehow going to be left to starve. You will be picked up by this system. You may well actually find yourself back home again, being supported because of the way in which the poor law worked, but you won't have taken a sort of, a complete risk with your life. You will have gone and tried your luck, and maybe you'll have another go and be luckier the next time. And what we know, what demographic historians have shown, is that England has by far the highest rate of urbanisation in the world between 1600 and 1800. In other words, its population is moving out of the countryside into towns and cities much faster than anywhere else in the world at that time, and much faster than Europe. And economic growth at that time was heavily driven by urbanisation. This is before the steam engine, before the use of carbon energy. So economic growth came mainly from what Adam Smith called the division of labour. People specialising, and specialisation happened in towns and cities, and then you traded the products. So this is a very important reason why England experiences this enormous growth-inducing, economic growth-inducing urbanisation. And then again, if we look at the period after 1945, when once again we re-find ourselves and recreate a new welfare state. The first 3 decades after World War II, people don't often realise this, saw the highest economic productivity growth in the country's history, higher than even during the Industrial Revolution, higher than since 1979 and Thatcherism and the free markets. The highest rates of productivity growth and full employment at the same time were 1950 to 1973 in this country's history. And that's when the welfare state was a new creation, giving the working classes new opportunities that they'd never had before.
So in the final chapters of our book, we are proposing 7 pillars of what we call an empowering society. That's a society that enables everyone to reach their potential and have the opportunities that they need to do that. And we're contrasting that with a disempowering society, the society of the post-austerity years of rising educational inequalities, rising health inequalities, and rising child poverty, which, of course, has been accentuated by some of the things that happened during the pandemic. And so that makes this a far more urgent task. And in order to do that, the first of our pillars is that we need to have a nurturing state. And that is the state that provides those resources, provides resources for education, for health, for digital inclusion, which has been another big issue before the pandemic and certainly during the pandemic, and for investment in all of the population. So it isn't just the very wealthy who have their own resources who are able to provide those resources for their children to thrive. It's the idea that everybody in society has the resources that they need to thrive. And obviously to do that, we come on to another of our pillars, which is that of fair taxation. And what we're saying here is not that we think that ordinary people need to have higher taxation or should be experiencing pay freezes, and that there's some notion that the population has to pay for the pandemic. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that even before the pandemic, it was obvious that we needed to put more resources into elderly care, social care, into addressing climate change, and into addressing these big deficits in health and education. And what we're saying is that if you look at the data, and we present this in our book, over the last few decades, we have built up a wealth mountain in this country, so that we've gone from a situation where the total amount of wealth was 3 times the size of our national income. We've gone over a few short decades to the situation in which it has grown to 7 times the national income, and that's at a time when the national income itself was rising. And during that time, we failed to find ways of tapping into that wealth mountain through reform of our taxation system. We're not accessing that. And at the moment, it's quite clear that we tax income more highly than we tax wealth. We have a highly regressive council tax, which is a property tax system. And there is some really good research around about what you could do about that and how you could tap into that wealth mountain in order to move to this new regime of fair taxation. And then moving on from that, another of our key pillars is that we need a new morality in business, and we call this ethical capitalism. And indeed, that was one of the strands of our IPPR essay. And what we're saying is we need to change the laws governing the purpose of corporations and what they're established to do, and we need to change the incentives that business leaders have, so that we move from this very extractive short-termism, feeding the demands of shareholders, offshoring profits, to instead of extracting value, to actually creating value for the economy, where business leaders actually look at the long-term health and interests of the businesses that they're running, and that they see a morality in contributing to the community that they're drawing their profits from, and in supporting the well-being of the workers that they're also drawing their profits from. Then finally, in thinking about these 7 pillars of an empowering society, we focus on the need for all citizens to have a fair voice, for their voice to be heard, and for local communities and local government to really be empowered with the resources that they need, and the voice in central government policy that they need. At the moment, we have an increasingly crony political system. We're seeing situations in which donors can have meetings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor behind closed doors to talk about policy. What we want to see is ordinary people, through things like citizens' assemblies and empowered local communities, becoming much more involved in government. And we're also proposing an extension of the franchise down to ages 15, 16 and 17, the young people who've been on the streets campaigning for climate change and for their future, and we think they should be empowered with a political voice too. So obviously, we're not saying that we are literally after the virus. We know that COVID-19 is still with us, and that there's a chance that it will be with us for a very long time to come. So after the virus is rhetorical. So what we're saying is there's a time before the virus, before 2020, and then we lived through a pandemic and we saw what happened. And so we've come to the point where we need to reflect, and we need to say, after that experience, after the virus, where are we now? And part of our argument is that when you get crises in history, these key moments, it might be a pandemic, it might be a revolution, it might be a natural disaster or a war. It changes the way that you see your society. It's almost like the idea of it being an X-ray, and it suddenly makes you capable of looking through your society and seeing what is underneath, the stresses that are there, which were already there, but you hadn't perceived them. And it can make you see the inequalities in the power structure in your society that may be interacting with these crises. And it may make you see a whole lot of things, as we did see in this period that we've lived through. The inequality in who died, that the impact on the elderly in care homes, on frontline workers who couldn't afford to take time off sick, and so on, all the deprived communities with all their issues that we've talked about. So if this is a watershed moment in our history, the question we're saying is, let's think back to other watershed moments. Let's think about 1945, which was in some ways similar. We went through a terrible war, a huge amount of sacrifice, and after that we had what some people have called a resetting of the social contract. So the idea that there's a relationship between citizens and the people who govern them, the society that they live in, and that the basis of that relationship changes in some way. And that certainly happened in 1945. The electorate voted for, in a landslide election, for a Labour government, and the reintroduction, the modern welfare state, and all the things that brought, including, by the end of that decade, the National Health Service. And all the benefits that Simon's already talked about that brought for us. And so our question now is there going to be a 2020s moment after the virus that might be comparable? And we saw, during the pandemic, we saw the incredible sacrifice of health and care workers on the front line, not only trying to save the lives of people suffering from coronavirus, but also, as we know, putting their own lives at risk, and some of them actually dying as a result. And we came out on our doorsteps on Thursday night and we clapped them, and that was great. But what we're saying now is, so are we now saying that we want to move to a fairer, a better, a more caring society? And what steps are we going to do that? And are we going to finally really do something about adapting our economy, rethinking our approach to growth and the climate damage that we're doing? So after the virus is a rhetorical challenge to everybody, to individuals, to politicians, to policymakers, to our readers, of course, to really think through what this now means and what the implications are, and what we're going to do to change, both as individuals but also as nations, and ultimately, working together, as citizens of the world and world leaders.